Greetings, everybody. It is GleeCon here again with another episode of More of Warcraft. On this episode, we're going to continue our journey through the Tides of Darkness novel. On our last episode, the Alliance got their Griffin Riders, their Wildhammer Dwarves with their Stormhammers. So they have something to combat from the air, as does the Horde with their dragons. So stay a while and listen to this one, Chapter 11.
Keep them moving,
Doomhammer bellowed, turning to look back at the Horde marching behind him.
We need to get through these peaks quickly. Why?
This was from Rend Blackhand. He and his brother Maim hated Doomhammer for killing their father and taking his place as war chief. They were among the few who dared to question Doomhammer's orders. Doomhammer allowed it, both because he knew any explanations he gave would filter back to the rest of the Horde, and because the Blacktooth Grin was a large, powerful clan and therefore useful. Besides, the brothers might question actions or decisions, but they never disobeyed a direct order, even when they disagreed with it. Doomhammer appreciated that and was willing to tolerate their questions up to a point.
Why what?
Doomhammer answered now. He was negotiating the steep path up the mountains, and most of his attention was on the rocks beneath his hands and feet. The forest trolls had already passed them by, scaling the cliffs as easily as they climbed trees, and had lowered ropes to aid the orc warriors in their climb. But Doomhammer refused to use them. He needed his troops to know he was still the strongest of them, and climbing the mountain unaided was one way to accomplish that. Rend had no such compunctions and was pacing Doomhammer with one of the stout ropes wrapped firmly around his left arm.
Why are we climbing?
Rend asked.
We could have gone around these mountains instead. Why are we taking this way? It is shorter, true, but harder. Scaling these peaks will slow us down.
Doomhammer reached the top of the cliff and grunted, wiping his hands clean of rock dust by rubbing them against his upper arms. He turned to face Rend as the other chieftain joined him at the peak, his brother and the other Horde leaders right behind him. They knew better than to reach the top before Doomhammer.
The humans think us stupid,
Doomhammer began, making sure all of them could hear him. He did not like having to repeat himself.
They imagine us as dumb brutes, just as we see the ogres.
Several turned to look below where the ogres were trailing behind even the orcs in their climb. They were strong enough to move past, but too clumsy to manage easily.
I encourage that image,
he grinned, showing his tusks.
Let them think us brainless. It makes our conquest easier because they underestimate us.
He stooped and picked up a small rock, tossing it from hand to hand as he spoke.
We've already fooled them once by splitting off a few clans when we reached the hinterlands, he pointed out. They busied themselves battling that portion of the Horde while we proceeded this way toward the mountains, and they will still be busy while we cross here. But we are headed to Quel'thalas, are we not?
Maim asked, the strange name causing him some difficulty.
Why not sail as close to it as possible then, and be there long before the humans emerge from the hinterlands? Because the elves will never let our ships pass unmolested, Doomhammer pointed out. Zul'jin says they are expert archers, and we would be trapped on the ships while they rained arrows down upon us. We would lose thousands, whole clans, before we could even reach the shore to fight them.
Several of the chieftains murmured. That had not occurred to them. The Horde was still not accustomed to the idea of using ships, though a few like the Stormreavers had taken to it quickly enough.
But we could have marched around the mountains, Rend pointed out, a longer route, but less difficult.
Doomhammer sneered.
Are you afraid of the challenge, then?
Several of the other chieftains laughed, and Rend bristled.
Of course not,
he snapped, raising his one fist, clearly ready to fight anyone who claimed otherwise.
I am up to the task. I was right behind you the entire climb.
No one dared point out that he had used a rope, while Doomhammer had not. The Blackhands were fearsome warriors and widely respected, another reason Doomhammer had allowed them to ask so many questions.
Then do you wish to challenge?
Doomhammer asked quietly, his voice dropping. Rend backed away quickly, paling as he realized what he had almost said. The Blackhands wanted to lead the Horde, but they would have to challenge and defeat Doomhammer in combat to do so, and they all knew he would kill them, even if they both attacked at once. A part of him kept hoping they would try, then he could replace them with a more reasonable Blacktooth Grin chieftain, but so far they had always backed down.
Going around might have been faster,
Doomhammer said finally when he saw Ren was not going to take the bait.
but our movements would have been more visible. This way we will come upon the elves with them unawares.
He grinned again.
If the humans survive their battle in the hinterlands and can march around the mountains, they may well reach Quel'thalas before us. And then if the elves allow them entry, they will all be gathered together when we attack.
He laughed and crushed the rock in his hand, dust spraying from between his fingers.
They have nowhere to go from there. We will crush them and make that land our own.
He opened his hand and let the dust and rock chips fall.
And if they are behind us, they will find us already established in Quel'thalas when they arrive, and we will beat them back and smash them against the foothills behind them.
He made a show of wiping his hands clean again.
Either way, we win.
The others all murmured, several of them grinning and laughing as well, and Ren nodded.
You are wise,
he grudgingly admitted.
This is a good plan.
Doomhammer nodded to accept the compliment.
Now we must continue,
Doomhammer told the rest of them.
There are still several peaks to cover.
He turned to Zulahad first, however.
Where are they?
He asked.
On their way,
the Dragonmaw chieftain answered, grinning at the murmurs that rose behind him. None of the other orcs knew anything more than that the Dragonmaw were planning something, with Doomhammer's full approval.
They have a long way to travel, but they are swift. They will reach us soon, and the world will tremble at their arrival.
Good. Then Doomhammer turned and glanced at the tall figure standing a short distance away, its long scarf blowing in the wind.
How far are we from Quel'thalas?
4 days' travel at this pace, Zul'jin replied, but we could be there sooner. The forest troll's eyes gleamed at the prospect, and his hands strayed to the axes at his side.
No,
Doomhammer ordered, ignoring the troll's obvious disappointment.
You will stay with us and continue lowering ropes for the troops.
He grinned at the troll leader.
Do not worry, you will get your chance to attack the elven homeland, but not until the Horde is right behind you, ready to roll down upon them.
Zul'jin pondered this a moment, then nodded. They'll be angry, he commented, then laughed. They'll emerge like wasps, ready to sting, and you will swarm them like ants, devouring them whole.
Yes,
Doomhammer liked the image. Ants were industrious workers and sturdy beyond all expectation. They could be nasty as well, gathering to overwhelm much larger creatures. Yes, ants will do nicely. And right now he signaled the march to continue, the Horde marching up the mountains behind him like an army of ants, intent upon the conquest. Red ants, maybe, for the Horde? 4 days later, Doomhammer and his chieftains looked down from a foothill that stood between the last mountain peak and the start of the Great Forest. The rest of the Horde was massing behind them, weary from the climbing and marching, but shaking off fatigue now that their next target lay before them. But none were as excited as the forest trolls. We be going now. Zul'jin looked eagerly at Doomhammer, who nodded.
Yes, go now, the war chief agreed. Bring the fight to the elves. Spare no one and nothing.
The forest troll leader grinned and tilted his head back to let loose a strange, warbling cry. Another forest troll appeared immediately just beyond where the two leaders stood, moving as silently and suddenly as a ghost. A third dropped from the rocks overhead to stand beside him, and another beside that one, and more after them until the small valley behind the hill was filled with the tall, lanky forest creatures. There were far more than Doomhammer remembered Zul'jin bringing with him, and his surprise must have shown because the forest troll leader grinned through his ever-present scarf.
Found more, he explained, laughing. With a Bok tribe. They be joining us.
Doomhammer nodded. He was not particularly afraid of them, though the trolls were taller than him. He had faced bigger and stronger foes before, and always he had been the one to walk away. Besides, in the months since forging their alliance, Zul'jin had impressed him. The forest troll was a clever one, but he also had honor. He had promised his people's aid to the Horde, and would not go back on that. Doomhammer was willing to risk his life on that belief. Of course, the fact that the forest trolls apparently hated these high elves certainly helped. The trolls had been all in favor of turning north toward Quel'thalas and had been almost frantic to breach the elven forest and begin finding and attacking the elves themselves. Doomhammer had insisted they wait, however. He wanted the rest of the Horde properly in position before the trolls struck, and Zul'jin had managed to keep his brethren in line even though he was just as eager to strike as they were. But now, the time for waiting was over. With a howl, Zul'jin leaped forward and raced down the hills. He did not slow as he struck the edge of the forest, but jumped up into the trees, springing easily from limb to limb. The rest of his people followed him, bounding into the trees and disappearing from view, with only the rustle of leaves and the occasional growl to mark their presence. But Doomhammer knew they would make their way deep into the massive forests, seeking elves and killing any they found. Soon the forest defenders would know about the trolls' invasion and would rush to meet them, and that would keep the elves busy, too busy to check their borders for other threats. Doomhammer signaled and the rest of the horde swept over the hill as well, marching steadily across the narrow strip of grassland, and at last reaching the first row of trees.
"Now, War Chief,"
a nearby orc warrior asked, axe at the ready. Doomhammer nodded, and the warrior turned back to the tree beside him, its trunk thick from age and smooth as silk, its leaves rich and green and smelling of nature and life and bounty, and with a mighty swing the orc chipped a large splinter of bark and wood from its trunk. Then he swung again, expanding the chip.
"No, no!"
Doomhammer snatched the axe from the startled warrior, shoving him back.
"Do not approach it at an angle, but straight on,"
he instructed. He pulled the axe back, bunching his muscles, and then swung with all his force, embedding the axe partway through the trunk. Then with a mighty wrench he retrieved the weapon and struck again in the same spot, deepening the wound. A third blow saw the axe almost through to the other side, only a small portion of wood and bark remaining. Doomhammer pulled the axe back, angling it upward as he did so its head pushed upward on the trunk, and the tree tipped and fell, snapping that remaining section from its own weight and momentum. The ground shook as the tree hit, and leaves and berries flew everywhere.
"There, like that."
He tossed the axe back to the warrior, who nodded and moved to the next tree in line. A second warrior was already stepping up to the felled tree, axe in hand, ready to begin the task of chopping the great tree into smaller segments. So we've got the peons working on harvesting lumber now. The elven lumber. Beyond him, more warriors were about the same task. Carrying supplies for an army as large as the Horde was a hopeless task, so instead, they took what they needed from the lands they had conquered, and the wood from these trees would keep the Horde's fires burning for weeks, perhaps even months. The fact that every tree they cut down deprived the elves of additional protection only made the task sweeter. Doomhammer was leaning upon his hammer, watching the work progress when he saw motion from the corner of his eye. A short, heavy-set orc with a bristling beard was heading toward him, scarred face twisted in an expression Doomhammer wasn't sure he liked. Gul'dan was excited about something.
"What is it?"
Doomhammer demanded before the chief warlock had reached him.
"Something you should see, mighty Doomhammer,"
Gul'dan replied, sweeping into a low bow. Chokal chuckled and aped the gesture behind him.
"Something that could aid the Horde greatly."
Doomhammer nodded and swung his hammer up onto his shoulder, gesturing for Gul'dan to precede him. The warlock turned and led both Doomhammer and Chokal back around, perhaps 100 feet from where he had stood. Here stood a massive stone, forcing a gap in the trees. Its rough surface was carved with runes, and even Doomhammer, who had no gift at all for the supernatural or spiritual, could feel the power radiating off this crude monolith.
"What is it?"
he demanded.
"I do not know exactly,"
Gul'dan answered, stroking his beard.
"but it is very powerful. I believe these Rune Stones, for there are others spaced evenly around the forest edge, serve as a mystic barrier. They did not stop us," Doomhammer pointed out. "No, because we use nothing more than our own hands and feet and blades," Gul'dan replied. "I believe these Rune Stones restrict the use of magic within, most likely only allowing the elves' own magic to function. I have tried tapping my magic here and I cannot, but if I move 10 paces away toward the hills, my spells return."
Doomhammer eyed the large hunk of stone with a new appreciation.
"So we take them and set them around our enemies and they cannot cast spells?"
he mused, wondering how many orcs it would take to move the monoliths and how they would transport them.
"That is one approach, yes,"
Gul'dan agreed, his tone clearly saying what he thought of such an idea.
"But I have another in mind, my war chief. If you will indulge me a moment."
Doomhammer nodded. He did not trust Gul'dan, not at all, but the warlock had proven useful with the creation of the Death Knights. He was curious what the stocky orc had in mind now.
"These stones contain immense magic," Gul'dan explained. "I believe I can harness that power for our own purposes. What do you mean?
Doomhammer demanded. He knew better than to give Gul'dan free rein. No, he wanted specifics.
I can use these to create an altar, Gul'dan replied, an altar of storms. By channeling the energy from these stones, I can transform creatures. We will make them more powerful, more dangerous, though they may suffer some disfigurement. I doubt any orc will let you experiment upon him a second time,
Doomhammer pointed out sharply. He still remembered quite clearly the night Gul'dan had offered the so-called Cup of Unity, the chalice of rebirth, to every chieftain in the Horde, and to any warriors they deemed worthy. Doomhammer had not trusted the warlock even then, and when Blackhand had invited him to drink, he had refused, saying he did not wish to take away from his chieftain by sharing such power with it. But he had seen what the liquid had done to his friends and clanmates. It had made them larger and stronger, yes, but it had also turned their eyes a glowing red, and their already greenish skin a vivid green, signs of demonic taint, and it had driven them all mad with bloodlust, with rage, with hunger. It had turned the once noble orcs into animals, crazed killers. Some of the orcs had regretted their transformation later, but by then it was of course too late. Gul'dan smiled as if he knew what his warchief was thinking, and perhaps he did. Who knew what strange powers the warlock now possessed? But he only replied to Doomhammer's words, not the thoughts behind them.
I will not use an orc to test these altars,
Gul'dan assured him.
No, I will use a creature that can benefit from even more strength, but will barely notice any reduction to intellect, he grinned. I will use an ogre.
Doomhammer considered that. They did not have many ogres, but the ones they did control were easily worth 10 times their weight in other soldiers. To make them even stronger, that would definitely be worth the risk.
All right,
he said at last.
You may build one of these altars. Let us see what happens. If it works, I will supply you with more ogres, any other race you wish.
Gul'dan bowed low, and Doomhammer nodded, his mind already on to other logistics as he turned away. All right, so we've begun the war with into the Elven lands. We have the Chronicles aspect of the Altars of Storms, the Rune Stones, and we're on the brink of just about the last troop. I mean, we haven't discussed like sappers or zeppelins or anything like that, so that still technically has to get talked about in the book. Submarines is another thing that could get brought up. The larger ships, sure. But this is where the Ogre Magi are going to come from. All right, we will continue this battle in the Elven lands with our next episodes. But this one is in the pipes, 5x5. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time on Lore of Warcraft.